Sin in Space, Chapter 4. Tony drew a cup of water from the tap on the plastic keg and set it to boil on the stove with a pinch of coffee makings, the ground, dried husks of a cactus-like plant that grew in some abundance on the desert. At its best, the stuff had approximately the flavor of a 5-day-old brew of Earth import brick coffee, made double strength to start with and many times reheated. It did contain a substance resembling caffeine, but to Tony it often seemed the greatest single drawback to human life on Mars. Automatically he checked the time. The stuff was completely undrinkable if it brewed even a fraction of a minute too long. Before he put any food on to cook, he stepped into the hospital half of his hut for a look at Polly. "Well!" "Hello, Tony." Anna barely looked up to acknowledge his presence. She'd moved the baby's basket next to Polly's bed and was bending over, peering into it. "We were watching the baby," she unnecessarily told him, and promptly returned to that fascinating occupation. "Just what is there to watch so hard?" the doctor demanded. "He's—" Anna finally transferred her attention. She made a helpless little gesture and smiled with an irritating air of mystery. "He's very interesting," she said finally. "Women!" Tony exploded. "Sit for hours watching a baby sleep." "But he's not sleeping," Anna protested. "He's hardly slept all morning," Polly added proudly. "I've never seen such a lively baby." "And how would you know what he was doing all morning? When I left here, you were asleep yourself, and Anna was all ready to go home and do likewise. Where's Jim?" "He wanted to go to work," Anna explained. "He was embarrassed, I guess, about staying out. I told him I'd stay. I wasn't really sleepy anyhow." "You weren't sleepy? After 26 hours awake?" He tried hard to be stern. "So you sent Jim off to work to give him a chance to brag about his baby. You weren't sleepy, and neither was Polly, and strangely enough, neither was the newcomer here. Well, as of now, all three of you are just too sleepy to stay awake, you understand?" Purposefully, he moved the basket to the far side of the room. What they said was true, he noticed. Young Kandro was wide awake and kicking, apparently perfectly content, not even crying. Strange behavior for a newborn. "Come on, Anna, clear out." He put the baby down and turned to Polly. "I'll give you 10 minutes to get to sleep before I stuff some more sedative into you," he informed her. "Didn't anybody ever tell you you're supposed to be tired now?" "All right." Polly refused to be ruffled. "He's an awfully nice baby, Tony." She settled herself more comfortably under the thin cover and was asleep almost before they left the room. "Now go on home," Tony told Anna. "I'm going to make myself some breakfast. Wait a minute. Did you eat anything?" "I did, thanks." Abruptly, she turned toward him and made a conscious effort at concentration. The abstracted look left her eyes, and she was brisk and alert as usual. "What about Polly? Don't you have to go out again? Somebody should be here." "I'll get a hold of Gladys when I leave. Don't worry about it." "All right." She smiled at his impatient tone. "You don't have to push me. I'll go." She picked up the heavy parka she had worn on her way over here in the early morning hours the day before. At the door, she turned back. "You're still coming over for dinner tomorrow night?" "You couldn't keep me away," he assured her. She came back into the room and took a ration slip from the drawer where Tony kept them. "You pay in advance, you see," she added, smiling. "And well worth it." Tony held the door for her, a habit he never quite lost even in the atmosphere of determined sexual equality that pervaded the colony. Not until she was gone did he remember the coffee he'd started. It was ruined, of course, and now he'd have to do without it. Water was too scarce still to waste because of carelessness. But coffee or no, he was hungry. He found a dish of barley gruel left over from a lunch he'd cooked for himself 2 days ago, heated it, and spooned it down hastily. Then, with a final check to make sure Polly was really asleep, he set out for the Porosky's house to find Gladys. At 14, Gladys was the oldest child in the colony. None of the adult members were over 35 years, and her status was halfway between that of a full working member and the little errand girl position her younger sister occupied. She was old enough to assist almost anybody at anything, still too young to take full responsibility for a job. Now, Tony found, she was over at the Radcliffes, sitting with Joan. It was his next stop anyhow. If they did have to leave Mars, it would have at least one good effect. The life of Joan Radcliffe would be saved. But, the doctor reflected, she'd die of a broken heart as surely as she was dying on Mars of whatever it was. His star patient, the thin, intense girl, lived only for the success of the colony on Mars, and life on Mars was killing her. When he knew what she had, maybe, Tony would know how to cure it. Meanwhile, all he could do was make a faithful record of its symptoms and try out treatments till he found one that would work, or until he was sure none of them worked. It was like an allergy, and it was like heart disease, and it was like fungus infection where you couldn't put your finger on the parasite. The biochem boys back on Earth would lick it someday, as they'd licked dozens of others, but right now, Tony didn't even have a name to tag it by. Joan came down with it 2 days after she and her husband, Hank, arrived on the shuttle rocket. If the doctor didn't find some relief for her soon, it looked as though she would have to go back on the next one. Tony bit hard on the stem of his empty pipe, slipped it into his pocket, and walked into the bedroom of the Radcliffe house. "How's it going?" He put his bag on the table and sat down on the edge of Joan's bunk. "Not so good." She had to work for a smile. A good colonist is always cheerful. "I can't seem to get settled. It's as if the bed was full of stale cracker crumbs and broken shells." She began to cough, short, dry barks that rattled her thin body, feathered light on Mars against the bed. Cracker crumbs and seashells. Sometimes it seemed that the damn condition reached her mind, too. It was hard to distinguish between the delirium of fever, the depression of fatigue and confinement, the distortions of mental disease. The spasm had passed. She battled the itch to cough again and counter-irritate her raw, constricted throat. Tony, watching, knew the guts it took. He had told her that a cough can be controlled, that she should control it because the spasms endangered her already overtaxed heart. But even before he warned her, she was fighting. A good colonist guarded her health. He was a colony asset. Everything for the colony. And for Henry, her husband. Joan was one of those thin, intense young people who give their lunch money to causes. It had taken a lot of skipped lunches to get her and Henry to Mars as shareholders, Tony realized. But she could never have been satisfied with less. The non-voting position of drop-in, for instance. She had to identify herself with a heroic, unpopular abstraction, or life wasn't worth living. Tony opened his little black bag. Joan whispered, "Got some magic in there for me? A good colonist is always cheerful. The great days are ahead." Middling magic, anyhow. He put the thermometer in her dry mouth and peeled back the blanket. There were new red lumps on her arms and legs. That was one phase of it he could treat. He smoothed on ointment and changed the dressings on the old puffy sore spots. "That's good," she whispered gratefully as he took the thermometer from her mouth. "So cool." Her temperature was up another 2/10 over yesterday's 101.3, and the thermometer was not even moist. Another injection, then. He hated to use them, as long as he wasn't sure of the nature of the disease, but one of his precious store of antihistamines seemed to give a little relief. It was temporary, of course, and he ardently hoped it was doing no permanent damage, but it did shrink the inflamed, watery bladder that her throat lining had become under the action of killer enzymes. She'd be able to breathe more easily now, and to sleep. It might last as long as 24 hours. One more day, and by that time, Hank would be back with a little of the latest Earth-developed hormone fraction. Tony had heard that Benaway, over at Mars Machine Tool, was using it with startling good results for serious burns and infections. It just might turn the trick. There was no way to know till they tried. Joan's eyes closed, and the doctor sat there staring at the parchment-like lids, her chapped and wrinkled lips. Tony grimaced. She was obviously being a fool. He rose noiselessly and crossed the room to the water jug. When he came back, he spoke her name softly. "Joan?" Her eyes opened and he held out the glass. "Here's some water." "Oh, thank you." She sighed dreamily, reaching out, but she snatched her hand back. "No, I don't need any." She was wide awake now, and she looked frightened. "I don't really want it," she pleaded, but her eyes never left the glass. "Take it, drink it, and don't be silly," he snapped at her. Then gently, he propped up her shoulders with his arm and held the glass to her lips. She sipped hesitantly at first, then drank with noisy gulps. "What are you trying to do to yourself? Didn't I order extra water rations for you?" She nodded, shamefaced. "I'm going to have some words with Hank when he comes back to make sure you drink enough." "It's not his fault," she said quickly. "I didn't tell him. Water's so precious, and the rest of you are working, and I'm just lying here. I don't deserve any extra water." He handed her the glass, refilled, and propped her up again. "Shut up and drink this." She did, with a combination of guilt and delight plain on her face. "That's better. Hank ought to be back tomorrow with the medication from Mars Machine Tool. I'll tell him about the water myself this time, and I don't want any nonsense from you about not drinking it. You're a lot more valuable to the colony than a few quarts of water." The sun was beating down more strongly when he stepped outside. It was past mid-morning already, and he had other patients.